Welcome to all the students and teachers who just joined us. And we're going to have our last panel discussion, followed by a dessert reception. So we still have cake and fruits and stuff. So, brace yourself.
Okay to sit here?
It is my pleasure to give the podium for the last panel discussion. Tamal.
Thank you. Thank you, Hannah. Good evening. My colleague. Before we start, you have each one of you. Before you start, no, it's a secret, just to them. You have 18 minutes, each one of you, okay?
18 minutes, all right.
18 minutes.
Okay,
Thank you.
18 minutes.
Good evening. We have 3 participants here, distinguished. Professor Khalid Al, the first one. I know you heard about him, but there are some others who haven't heard yet. So a few words about each one of you. Professor Khalid Al is an expert of educational policies, community leadership, refugees, migrants, social equity, and diversity. He is a member of the doctoral faculty in school improvement at Texas State University. He was awarded honorary professor of international studies and Presidential Scholarly Excellence Award for 2022. For the past 2 decades, he conducted studies in the Middle East, Europe, and the USA. His joint book, Higher Education in the Area of Migration, Displacement, and Internationalization, was awarded at best book as a best book by the Comparative and International Education Society. Professor R also serves as a co-editor of our book, shared book, Enhancing Values and Dignity, Democracy and Diversity in Higher Education, Comparative Insights for Challenging Times. Professor R will speak about immigration, education, and leadership, policy, practice, and schooling for a world at war. Professor R, please.
Toda raba, Tamar. Thank you very much, Tamar. Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Tamar, for the introduction. This morning, I spoke about the access to higher education for refugees, displaced, and atypical students. And in this presentation, I'm going to present a joint chapter that I wrote with Corinne Priam. Corinne is a French, and she is located in Ohio. And she collected data about African refugees in Europe and the United States. I collected data on refugees of the Middle East in Europe and the United States, and this is how our work overlap, compare, and contrast. And in our chapter, we tried to spend less time speaking about the challenges, which is like entail all the pathway of displacement. And we more spend time on the welcome. how the welcome looks like and how it should look. And so when we speak when we speak about refugees in K-12 education, we speak about minors where children of up to 17 creates more than 50% of this population. And the numbers are getting higher and higher each year, where the number of children of refugees and displaced overcomes 80 million nowadays, following the war in Ukraine and other nation states. So this is a global crisis. And in this chapter, we want to explore how we react, what our response look like, and how we are up to the task of welcoming. And both my pictures are used intentionally. So nobody arrives by airplane ticket. So this is the pathway. And as a Sudani poet put it, no one will put his son in a mouth of shark or a shark unless the sea is safer than the land. So, and it says a lot about the pathway and how we react. In terms of policy, we have or identified in our scholarship reactive type of policy or proactive type of policy. So reactive, we're gonna dealing more negatively with the burden of this issue, while proactive policy entails reimagining and reframing of how we handle this phenomena. And of course, within this, we have the state, or here in the US space, the federal and the state, and then the public discourse. And I just brought like different quotes of one of the welcome, and the other one is the xenophobic reaction to the phenomena. So how different countries respond to the refugees influx in the state reception approach, the educational policy, and what K-12 educational leaders do with that, how this is handled. So in terms of theory or conceptual framework, both policy response, leadership agency, educational praxis, stakeholders, commitment, and community cohesion. We've been looking throughout two theories. One is the agency, and the other is social justice, while our regime of truth is seeking to understand migrants in new context, or as we better explain this as a post-migration phenomena. So moving beyond the imperialistic politics, the new liberal politics, how we reframe our discourse of xenophobia towards dignity, a very key term that we used in this book, and how we revisit the current policy landscape and culture, and how we invite people to our homes with trust, respect, and dignity. And when I pose now these questions, I just had to analyze what a small country like Qatar paid for the Mondial Games and what it is. And they choose to open these games with a very humanistic message. And I'm looking now if they are up to the demand of expressing the same approach toward the earthquake, you know, in the Middle East, in Syria and Turkey. So this is where we examine what you, Nimrod, tried, you know, to express in your very thorough lecture. Here where our values are examined, you know, in real life situation, and not in luxurious, you know, intellectual discourse. How we exercise radical participation in engagement, so that these newcomers are arriving in a welcoming space. So are we, you know, gonna open the doors and deal with the welcome, or handle the exile, which is the other side of it, handling the exile and of course the alienation? And we need to choose. We need to choose which sign better represent us. We welcome men and women, all races, all abilities, all beliefs, all nations. You are safe here, or fair is it. And fair, so I have nothing to do with this. Which sign or term reflects our core value? Which one? Are we choosing this sign with black glasses? I don't see. I don't know. It has nothing to do with me. Or I'm gonna reflect. And here are some of the pictures of the pathway of refugees into our doors, into our shores. This is how they arrive. And I'm going to tell you, there were different incidents that the Maltese want to approach. They cannot get into their neighbors' space in the sea, while their neighbors are not approaching, you know, a ship of 300 people, and they just let it sink. And there were different art exhibitions in Europe that presented, you know, pictures of different, you know, incidents like the one I presented. And when we receive refugees, we want to see them as blank. Then we run very quickly to speak about integration, which is one of the shortcomings. What are the main challenges that refugees poses to us, and how educational leaders are up to this task? As far as to the challenge in this book, Ira Boguch, who is a fourth generation of Jewish displaced from Europe, coming to the shores of New York. And Jeff Brooks and I edited this book, spoke about the challenge. And in this special issue, we tried to bring the 6 different national education systems, both in the US, in Sweden, in Canada, in Germany, in Turkey, and how we are responding. I hope I did not miss anybody. No. Oh, and Lebanon, and how they responded to this phenomenon. And in this book, which was translated both to Turkish, and now it is translated to Arabic, this book published by Routledge, I laid down of how like a model of welcome, like a cultural relevant leadership model entails of not just school discourse, but ecosystem understanding of the whole issue and how to handle it. So, and this is in one of my papers, I laid down the challenges. So what are the challenges that we need to deal with? These are learning needs, including language learning, catching up in schooling. You could see a fourth grade girl in a first grade class in Turkey because her education was disrupted for 3 years or 4 years or up to 9 years now. Catching up on schooling, adjustment to new education system, then social needs, communication, sense of belonging, strong personal identity and emotional needs, safety, coping with separation, loss, and trauma. And then there are individual factors, interpersonal factors that we need to tend to, and then school level factors. All of this is interweaving into a policy and practice understanding. So as you can see in this journal article, I analyzed all education and leadership models that deal with newcomers in the last 20 years. And I tried to synthesize these models and out of these models to come up with a model. And in the other journal article, I analyzed policy and policy enactment in different nation states. And so as far as to the models of education and leadership of welcome, one is systemic shared leadership, where we are sharing this agency, social justice education and leadership, ethical leadership, and cultural relevant leadership. These were the models that has been widely adjusted or adopted to deal with the phenomenon. And where we are at, exactly as you posed this today, Nimrod. So as you can see, we have the social justice as ideology, rhetoric, if you want, liberal democracy, critical humanist, but where we are as the activist professionals, what we do with these values. So there is the intra-institutional activism and there is the social activism. So we have a rule that we can do as teachers, as educators, as public intellectuals, as lecturers, and as professors. So what we are doing in terms of supporting schooling, inclusive schooling, I'm gonna share with you the following. I was in Toronto and I needed to make an interview with somebody that has been helping, students to get in, etc. And I asked, can I interview you? I'm doing a research on this. She said, after 3:30 o'clock, if you can. I said, okay, I will wait. She's very busy. And then in the end of the day, I approached to, interview her and ask her, well, what you are working here? Are you a social worker? She said, no, I'm a professor in chemistry at OIC Institute. I am a daughter of Slovakian refugees, an American family raised me up, and I'm giving back to community. Luckily, my two sons, one is a psychiatric, the other one is an engineer. They need me less, they need my money less, so I'm spending days a week here in this school as a volunteer. I couldn't have more stronger agency than this. And I think here is the activist professional that we can play. I asked myself when I landed at Texas, what can I do instead of just speaking about this? So now I am supervising 9 students. 3 of them are doing dissertations about this. I am visiting the international school at Austin, which has been dealing only in the last year with Afghanis, now Ukrainians, and some African. In one class, I saw 25 different students from different nations. So what we do there, if there is a time I can volunteer, I want to volunteer there. And I can say that my wife as well is volunteering there. So this is the list. I'm not here standing to say, oh, I'm doing. No, I'm doing less. I'm doing less up to the level in the last 3 days. When I had some pain in my knee, I am embraced and shy to say I have pain in my knee, because it is more painful to be under these rocks in Syria and under these rigs in Turkey. I can't say it's painful for my knee. My knee is okay. I'm handling this. So there are a level of small scale social change, which comes with innovation, social acceptance, and selective elimination, or what you use today, dismantling all this deficit discourse. Then large-scale social change, how we can change the whole public discourse, because a deeper understanding of diversity starts on recognizing diversity biologically, socially, culturally, lingually, and the list is very, very, very long and can be longer than we expect. But it starts from a deep recognition. So, and here is the model, and I'll stop here. So it entails critical self-reflection. This is first. Then deconstruct and reconstruct, revisiting, reimagining, rethinking, and then it takes agency and support of sustainability. So this is the cultural responsive leadership that we pose in this chapter. So as far as the critical reflection, examine your background, your identity, your beliefs, your axiologies, value system, ontology, how you see this whole phenomenon. Examine your inner self and your relation to this phenomenon, how critical you are, and how acting critically in this boutique, nice boutique of social justice and equity that everybody wants to speak about it and be part of this language. You know, I'm associate editor of a journal, and I'm receiving papers about equity and social justice from people that are occupying others. And they're writing and sending and arguing for social justice. Oh, God's sake. So we will keep, facing this, but we need to have a voice in facing this. So how agitative we are and what are our actions look like. So I would like to stop here so I am equitable towards my colleagues in using the time, provided. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Khalid, or Khalid. I think a few words after your exciting words will be that, first of all, we both of us are doing the first step. We are just very good friends. So I think this is the first step for all of us.
And Tamar is mentoring my eldest son, who chose to stay in Israel. She is mentoring him in his undergrad studies at the college that she is serving there.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. The next distinguished speaker is Professor Cole Riley. Professor Cole Riley specializes in issues relating to elementary education at Towson University. He deals with empirical research that focuses upon matters of social justice regarding gender, sexuality, race, and class conflicts, as well as other issues of identity and equity. Professor Riley also deals with multicultural considerations and didactical methods in heterogenic classes. His title this evening is Confronting Privilege as Pedagogy, teaming up to challenge students to meaningfully explore matters of identity and social justice. Professor Cole Riley, please.
Hi, my name is Cole Riley. Start my timer. So at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the title of the chapter that this is largely referencing in the book that's coming out, that came out recently. So the chapter was called Face to Face with Race, Power, and Intersectionality, Challenging Undergraduates to Meaningfully Engage with Matters of Identity and Privilege. Here, I'm just going to push into a certain aspect of it, but this comes largely out of work that I've done with Dr. Mubina Kamrani, who's here, sitting over here. So it's strange to present without her because so much of this project was done together. So the story sort of began in January of 2017. It was soon after a very charged political election. And so just honestly, days before the 45th US president took office, Mubina, as a Muslim woman of color who also immigrated to the US, had good reason to be nervous to teach her diversity course that semester to a lot of undergraduates. She had good reason to be nervous, given all the political charge at the time, feeling she might be attacked or made to feel unwelcome in her own classroom. And she's been teaching these things for a long time. Many times DEI classes, more often than not, taught by women or people of color or women of color. And often there's a lot about their identity that's scrutinized unfairly for that. I also teach such courses, and I do not suffer the same criticisms often. In fact, I'm handily patted on the back very often for a lot of things I do that I don't know that I do better, but it's part of it's my privilege in that. So she spoke up at a conference before the semester started saying like, hey, I'm kind of nervous. And there was sort of crickets in the audience, and they just went to the next question from the crowd. So I came up behind her and I said, maybe I can help. Maybe I can be a guest teacher. Maybe I can just be president. Maybe I can be an ally. Maybe I can do something. So this sort of is about a project that evolved from that. That first semester, we worked together where I came in a few times, and I was specifically there to help bring up things about white privilege, male privilege, that she was feeling uneasy to bring up. Not that she didn't know it. She knows the content. She's very strong in that. But she just felt uneasy in the circumstances. So me being there, that led to some of the best professional development I've had here. So that became a project that went a couple of years actually, and we became faculty fellows together to research this. So when you look at our two identities, I tried to slice up all sorts of types of an inventory of identities. All the ones here that are purple are different between Mubina and me. Okay, the ones that are blue are somewhat different, and the ones that are sort of that pale blue, the Easter blue color, is the things that we have probably the most in common. But we have differences on race, religion, marital status, age, sex, gender identity, sexuality, language. So the idea of co-teaching with her offered an interesting dynamic that I thought would be unique to study in it. And so we were looking at sort of, as teachers, we look at how we relate to our students, and the curriculum we teach, but we were especially interested initially in how we related to each other and how we approach the data differently. So after sort of the first semester of doing any of this stuff, and it was well received, Mubina asked her students these three questions. What did you make of Dr. Riley's lessons with us? What have they led you to think, wonder, or feel? And what, if anything, did you learn? And our initial observations were that what students were writing about were certain patterns, values of hearing a frank, vulnerable voice, Never saw a white person so comfortably self-critical of himself with race. Finding their own voice, feeling a sense of having permission to speak. These are coming out in the students' writing. Get woke. Now it's dated because to be woke now is almost it carries a different meaning, right? But their language was like ready to get woke or waking up. And this is all pre-pandemic when this part started. So race is everywhere. They started to see that. They felt compelled to expect more of themselves and others, and new realizations that I or we can use our own privileges to do good. So they're wondering how to act or behave when pushed outside their comfort zone, but it was well received. So when we looked further, there was something Rubina noticed immediately the first time I was in her classroom, which was that although, again, Rubina taught the students all semester. I came in like 3 or 4 times, something like that. And she had already known their names. I came in and I learned, but she said immediately, Cole, you seemed closer to the students. Like they seemed more familiar with you immediately than they were with me. And so we're sort of unpacking what's that about? And is that just about race? Is that about age? Is that about what our first language is? It is about, I have a lot of pop culture references that are very specifically American. And again, I'm not the same generation of students, but I was closer to it. There were all sorts of things it could be. Plus, we have different styles. I'm a visuals and PowerPoints and all sorts of things, and that's just different. So it could be a number of things. So when we looked closer at, when we studied this for honestly a couple of years, there seemed to be 8 distinguishable themes that emerged. And the first one is sort of related to that. So I color coded them because that's me. So I'm just going to show you some of the highlights of each of these themes. And I'm going to show some student data with some of their quotes. But the relatability one is sort of like that idea of being closer to. So the 2 I'm going to read are the underlying ones, but there's more if you want to read. And for each of these things, by the end, I have down what I know about the students based on what they turned in. When they turned this in writing anonymously, but they often said like, as a Black woman, I was like, okay, we can say that that came from. So it just indicates whenever people spoke, what they specifically identified. And if we didn't know, we didn't know. So I'll read the top one and the bottom one as the most significant in the relatability theme. I do believe the fact that he was white likely impacted how I viewed the whole presentation. Coming from him, I guess I felt I may be able to relate more. And that was what a white student said, and that was a white male specifically. Now you're going to notice a lot of the data, it comes from white students. The class were more white than non. I would say probably 75% of the class I would identify as white. But that's also interesting in the themes, really, of the data that was most clearly pointing out these themes. It was often coming up from white students, but I promise as we get later in the presentation, there are students who are BIPOC and they have voices too. The bottom one I think is interesting too. If someone else did the presentation who was a different race, I may have not responded to that as well as I did to him. I tend to put walls up when people stress things I don't know or don't agree with. He never tried to push feelings on us. And I would say that when I have it kind of blinking between red and orange, because it brings up the next theme, which is minimizing or marginalizing perspective. So although they were often very complimentary of me, I didn't like what it was insinuating about people of color and other marginalized identities. There was this assumption, well, he's not biased, but all of them are. He's not pushing an agenda because he's just like me. And that's why many of these are coming from white voices. And I think that's worth interrogating. That's like, I don't deserve it. I've been called neutral and objective. I've never been neutral in my life. I mean, I have neutral colored pants. That's about it with me. So I do have an agenda. I do have an opinion. Social justice. I do have a bias in that, but I get forgiven it. I get credited with things that aren't true of me. So that idea of the truth and what's being said, that's not true. It might be flattering. It might sound nice, but what is in the absence of that? What is in the negative space of when you attach that to the white person and you don't give that sort of credence to others? So another quote that was sort of in reference to minimizing or marginalizing perspectives of others, and specifically minority. And again, there are ways in which I am a minority. I don't think the students necessarily read that about me, but I think what they saw was white male cis. So I think he did a good job talking about it in a neutral way and not offending anyway. Another presenter may have made it more about prejudice that they've experienced instead of how race was seen in his eyes. So the fact that they assume I've never experienced prejudice with regards on the negative end of it means I'm neutral, because again, that's attaching to who said that. It was said by a white voice. So that's someone who wants to attach that to themselves. So it's curious about some of these ideas. The next one is about anxious empathy. And this one, I've got a visual for it real quickly. There's sort of this idea that many of the students, when they watch me talk about these things, and I am comfortable talking about them, because I've tried to do the work. I've taken a lot of classes, I've done research work, I've tried to reach out to communities. One of my PhDs is in women and gender and sexuality studies. You don't get that PhD unless you do a lot of coursework on this stuff, get familiar with conversations. But I noticed that the students often would look at me and they were, so I do improv also. And I know when you're up on stage doing improv, the audience is rooting for you. They're thinking, oh my God, I don't think I could do that. That's, if I make up something and it's kind of funny, it might get more credit because they're thinking, well, he didn't have a script. How brilliant is that? So I just felt like either I'm the improv actor that they're rooting for, but I think a lot of students claimed that I could never do what he's doing. I can't publicly speak about race in front of a bunch of, when a portion of the class is BIPOC, and aren't they going to shoot him down? Aren't they going to tell me he's getting it all wrong? So that idea of me looking like I'm on a tightrope and them rooting for me was kind of curious. So I call that anxious empathy. One of the quotes there is, as someone who is the same race as Dr. Riley, I was cringing a little because he was speaking, afraid that he was going to say the wrong thing. It's hard to talk about race and have people take you seriously as a white male. I feel like it's bold to talk about race as a white man because you have to worry about offending people or coming off to people in an ignorant way. Again, boo-hoo, it's really hard to be a white guy. So that idea, that empathy is so much attached to me. And again, yeah, race can be difficult to talk about, but like, who gets to write most of the history books? Who gets to write most of the curriculum? Who gets to control the conversation for so long? Who gets to rule things out in Florida? It has largely been people who look like me. And so that idea of, yeah, maybe there's accountability now, maybe there's consequences if you step too off, but so it's worth acknowledging that part. I related to him maybe because I understood the difficulty of speaking of the topic of race without people finding some kind of error. There's this assumption, and I don't think it's unfounded, but for a lot of people to feel like I can't participate in that conversation because I'm going to say something wrong and it's going to explode on me. I'm going to be ended, I'm going to be canceled, I'm going to be whatever. And so I think they liked seeing that I didn't actually feel like I was on a tightrope. I'm comfortable with the conversation. I'm ready. I'm not trying to be defensive, but I'm comfortable in these waters. Okay. So the next theme was opening spaces to deconstruct whiteness. So two of the quotes I thought were most interesting were, again, you'll notice most of these quotes are coming from white students, but there are some, the later themes do have more people of color. He seemed very well informed, unbiased, and skilled at speaking about uncomfortable topics in a way that makes others feel more okay with also sharing thoughts. Like, at the top, they told me I created a safe space. Like the first day I was there, I'm thinking, Mubina has been teaching the class all semester. She does a lot toward this, but I was immediately credited with that. And I didn't deserve it, but maybe there's something about my aesthetic that carries with it something that's familiar to others. And I don't know that that's right, but it's what they're thinking. I was able to share things about my experience with race that I would normally only share with close friends and family. Students did talk about feeling more willing to speak up and share things around the whole class. And again, if you've ever taught a DEI class or taken a DEI class, sometimes people are shy to speak up and it's the same voices speaking up again and again. So I think I was making a positive difference, but I wonder again, I wrote a piece once called, Am I Part of the Problem? If I use my whiteness, my maleness in these classes, and it goes over well and I get good evaluations, that might be good for learning, but is that also making it harder for people of color who might not get the same evaluations, or because I'm making some people who have more often than not been comfortable get to stay comfortable? Is that part of the problem? I don't know. So I like teaching with Mubina. I like teaching with someone who contrasts my privileges because I think that's a more interesting conversation. I wish universities were more inclined to fund that and to pay us to co-teach and things like that, but that's not a battle that we were winning, even though that's a big part of the article. All right, the next two, breaking new ground. Initially, I felt nothing but guilt, disgust. This is after we did some activities with like Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the White Knapsack and a couple other things with Tim Weiss. And so a person says, initially, I felt nothing but guilt, disgust, and almost a little shame at how I was oblivious, how much I had truly taken for granted, how truly unfair and sometimes appalling the world can be. I'm still wrestling with the feeling of guilt and shame, trying to mentally work out ways I can try to better the situation. And another voice said, I feel like he made people uncomfortable, but not in a bad way. We learned a lot about how to become aware of others. And that was something that on the front end, when I was planning with Rubina, so much of her unease going into the semester was, I think some of it was cultural. Rubina doesn't want to make people uncomfortable. She's so generous. She's so kind. I'm not. I'm friendly, I think, but I actually want an uncomfortable experience. I want something. I believe in that, but I also know I can get away with things that are different in what I can do, that no one questions certain things about me when I make things uncomfortable that they might attach to someone else. So, but we thought that was interesting because that was one of the things when we were initially planning things out. It's like, what if we pushed further? What if you pushed further? And we were saying, oh, I'd be nervous to do that. I was saying, well, if if my being here helps with it, let's use it. So let's use privilege to maybe push through privilege or challenge privilege a bit. Deflective defensiveness. Now, this was where some students wanted to deflect, like so much of this was very positive. I'm opening up, I'm hearing ideas. This is making me think differently, but some were definitely deflective, trying to not, or either one wanted to say, well, he's older than us. So the world he talked about growing up, it's not like that anymore. His hometown might have been racist, but it's probably not anymore. I assure you it is. But the bottom one I thought was interesting because it was from a white female student who said, I just wonder about this. So this is after we read the 45 little privileges and that a white woman named Peggy McIntosh is afforded that if she wasn't a white woman, she wouldn't be afforded. And there's so many things that most students resonated with, little things about just a Band-Aid being designed, the color to blend into their skin, and knowing that an entire company and industry is designed around working towards white supremacy, at least comfort. She said, I just wonder about this because I know they don't all apply to me. It would be interesting to see how many of them resonate with Dr. Riley. In the past, I've been told I don't know what it's like to deal with poverty because I'm white. Simple things like makeup. I've been told it must be easy for me to find a skin tone, but it's not. And it just that looking for an excuse, I don't want to. The last group was talking about, okay, I feel guilty. I feel all sorts of things. I don't know how to handle this, but I'm at least going to grapple with it. This is someone who doesn't want to grapple with it. They want to say, hey, I could find at least one of those things that doesn't relate to me, so I can dismiss the whole thing. That deflective defensiveness. And I was talking to Mubin about what I was referring to as whining. Like I said, that I'm seeing some white whining in this language. I'm seeing people justifying why you can't make me feel uncomfortable when I think how often have people of color been made to feel uncomfortable and it's just taken for granted. So there's a real colonialism happening there about that. So finally, some voices of color. The last two, I promise that themes are related to BIPOC students, but it's different what their focus are. So initially, some BIPOC students offered skepticism about when I showed up. Like, what's it going to be like when he talks about race? Wait, you brought in someone to talk about race and it's a white guy? So some of the language here, I'll admit that initially my personal bias kicked in when I realized that there was a white man prepared to talk about race relation issues. Since he was white, for some BIPOC people, it may not have stuck with his audience. So it was interesting. So much of our data was showing how so many of the white students who the class was predominantly white were finding this, oh my God, this really got through breakthroughs. But there was a BIPOC student raising a good point. Like, this might be good for white students, but this might kind of not work for the BIPOC students in the room. So it was although that student later voiced that they actually changed their mind and said that it was just my initial bias, but it's a valid point to say that, I could be colonized in space. So this is the last theme I have for today, the 8th, credibility. So this was credibility afforded especially from BIPOC students to me of saying, no, he has something to offer here. So I'll read the two here. They're also by student 3. So, but actually, and this is an African-American female, but actually after listening to him, not only was he careful in his wording, delivery, and presentation of the topic, but he spoke about his own frame of reference and came across as more of a racial ally than an outsider. While I default to preferring topics of race to be led by racial minorities, maybe it helped my white classmates to be more receptive to information since it came from someone with a similar racial background. And she continues, he allowed the racial elephant in the room to be addressed and discussed openly. Overall, his topic was needed because white people probably could have felt the same way he felt, and they could have probably learned something from it. Until race becomes a less taboo topic in America and an open discussion is led and facilitated by a diverse group of people, we can't fully call ourselves a progressive nation. I thought that was like powerful words for a student to just, offer up on feedback. So these were just my last 2 slides here. Things I think about through this as I'm trying to think of how to be an ally, how to make sure we're an ally, not just showing up, not taking the mic, not speaking for, but speaking with, making this, because Ruby and I didn't get to teach every class that way. We did this for quite a few semesters, but then I had to go back to like the rest of real life. The grant had run out, and I hope I left her in a better position to teach the class even when I'm not there. I know she made me a better teacher and what I brought back to the classroom. So, but these ideas of acknowledging, cultural capital, there's my timer. What is the cultural capital that we bring into this? Where are the gaps? What when can we get away with saying things? And when there are times where, well, she and I could plan out and say like, hey, I'm going to say that if that'll help, or can you say that because it might give different credibility? So these are just ideas that I was toying around with. I don't want it to be ammunition. I want it to be cultural capital, but and then this is just last assumptions that we're unpacking about working as a team and how this works out. So how two people can see the same thing from two sides and it's a different experience. So I'll stop there. I hope we have questions later.
Thank you so much, Professor Riley. And the next one, Professor Robert Rook. Robert Rook is a professor of history in the Department of History at Towson University since 2005. He specializes in military history and environmental history. He chaired the department from 2005 until 2011, when he became director of interdisciplinary studies, a position he held until 2021. Professor Rook focuses on multiple perspectives regarding international policies and regional conflicts. His title this evening is Democracy versus Diversity in the Mississippi River Valley, 1927 till 2005. Professor Robert Rook, please.
Technology's working. All right, I guess this is working. Okay. It's been a long day, but I do want to begin by referencing a couple of comments that came out during this afternoon, this evening's presentations. I was very much taken by one of Tamar's comments earlier today about the need to make a more complete narrative, a more inclusive narrative, and in doing so, making it a more valuable narrative. That's something that very much hit me, and it's something that I try to do, hopefully somewhat successfully. And then a little later this evening, when Nimrod spoke about the notion of eco-humanism and this notion of how we relate to nature, intersects and reflects and shapes how we relate to one another and how our society works. Well, a lot of that really does help set up what I'm going to talk about, hopefully briefly here this evening, because as a boy, in my boyhood, early adolescence, I grew up in a very much troubled, conflicted, desegregating American South. Several southern states, moved around a lot as a kid, sparing you the reasons behind that. But I really developed a pretty good awareness and maybe even a bit of an understanding of bigotry. And I basically concluded at a fairly early age that bigotry is one of the more advanced forms of ignorance. And that ignorance has its roots in a sometimes simple, but sometimes very complex lack of awareness that poses a direct challenge to diversity and diverse communities, and more recently, an open and fairly direct challenge to democracy itself. Ironically or not, it is this lack of awareness that provides fertile terrain for both historians and disasters. Not that historians and disasters are necessarily related, but maybe they are, who knows. But there are two things in this landscape of unawareness that I want to address tonight in this presentation. Namely, lower tier institutions of governance and the natural and built environments. Elements that place all of us, but most particularly diverse populations in peril from time to time. And in terms of the first thing, the lower tier institutions of governance, I am not talking about Civics 101 constitutional institutions, the presidency, the Congress, the federal court system, those things we learn about in school. What I am going to talk about are the myriad federal agencies that manage both affairs of state and the day-to-day life circumstances of citizens, those institutions. Some of them well-known, others hopefully better known after I'm done here tonight. And in terms of the other category, I'm talking about the natural and built environments, Mother Nature, for lack of a better term, and the technical and scientific attempts to manage nature and the sometimes disastrous consequences of this management attempt. And these two things have a significant impact on many communities that not only make our nation more diverse, but also lead those very same communities into adverse and sometimes disastrous circumstances that surrounding communities, less diverse, do not suffer to the same degree, nor do these affected communities recover as quickly or even as completely as the surrounding communities. And so it's with that I want to turn to the Mississippi River Valley, but hopefully before I'm done, we'll be able to move beyond the Mississippi River Valley and see how some of what transpired over the past 20, 25, in some cases, depending on how I want to count it, going back 50 years, brought us to a terrible circumstance in 2005 and leaned forward into circumstances that, believe it or not, have repeated themselves. So what you're looking at here is some of you may remember this, almost 20 years ago, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, hit many places, but New Orleans got hit badly. And a particular section of New Orleans, the lower 9th Ward, was devastated. In fact, if you look at this photograph, that's the lower 9th Ward. And what you see floating, sitting on top of some homes, is a Mississippi River barge. Now, in certain insurance policies, this would be classified as an act of God. And so the insurance company's off the hook. But I want to argue that what happened in New Orleans' lower 9th Ward, a largely African-American community, some estimates, and again, the data is kind of sketchy, between 85 to 95%. What happened there during Hurricane Katrina was a convergence of circumstances, not just floodwaters, not just a hurricane, a convergence of circumstances, decades in the making, that in fact, not only led to disaster in the lower Mississippi River Basin, New Orleans, but actually we can see playing out along coastlines in places like New York and New Jersey with Hurricane Sandy. So this is not just an isolated phenomenon. And there are sort of elements at work that I hope to make more explicit, because in terms of becoming more aware of how things work and how things unfold and collapse and who gets exposed and who gets to recover, this is something that we as citizens really need to be a bit more aware of. So what happened? What happened outside of the general statement I made here a minute ago is lower 9th Ward was actually one of those neighborhoods in New Orleans that developed across the 1940s and 50s that had an absolutely jaw-dropping rate, as this New Orleans, Louisiana promo blurb stated, that it was, according to this, it was 98% Black by the time Katrina hit. And again, the data, depending on what you read, it's kind of sketchy, but generally it ranks in there at 85% plus. And there were a lot of homeowners there who didn't have flood insurance. So not only did they suffer the disaster of the hurricane, they also suffered the aftermath of there was really no way back, because many of these folks ended up being evacuated to Houston and to Dallas, and as far north in some cases as Memphis, and they wanted to come home, but to what? And by the way, the lower 9th Ward was one of the last of the areas in New Orleans to be completely drained and have its electricity and other utilities restored. And that had to do with good old-fashioned Louisiana, New Orleans, Louisiana ward politics. and something that gets played out in governances throughout the American South and elsewhere. So what about setting it in motion? Well, this is where, again, as a historian, I look to the past. And there's a lot of it there, but given our time constraints tonight, I want to focus on just a couple of things. The worst disaster to hit New Orleans and the lower Mississippi River Basin wasn't up to Hurricane Katrina. It was the Great Flood of 1927, which was just an absolute disaster. The death toll, the damage to property, it was so severe that the then Secretary of Commerce, one Herbert Hoover, really won a good deal of acclaim for how he handled this disaster. And Congress got involved, and they ultimately ended up passing the Flood Control Act of 1928. And one of the things that always has amused me as a history teacher is that Herbert Hoover seems to have been born with one purpose and one purpose only. He was brought into American history to lose to Franklin Roosevelt in a presidential election. It was almost like his mom sat him down and said, Herbert, you're going to have a really bad moment later on, but it's all going to work out and you'll fit into the history books. So just move on with it. So Herbert Hoover actually, his job in handling this flood in 27 helped win him the presidency in 1928 before he lost it in 1932. But the bigger point is basically what happened with the Flood Control Act of 1928 is the Army Corps of Engineers began to re-engineer the Mississippi River, building a series of levees along the length of the river that did any number of things that, yes, it controlled floods, but it also engineered a form of vulnerability. It narrowed the river in certain places. It removed any number of off-ramps for water buildup, floods further upstream, and channeled them downstream. It actually sped up the flow of the water, engineering a circumstance that when it ran into the flood surge of hurricanes even prior to Hurricane Katrina, flooded out the lower Ninth Ward. But then I want to expand, as I said at the outset here, that we're looking at New Orleans, the lower Mississippi River Basin, but actually, the United States is a big country with a lot of water landscape, both coastal and riverine. And so the Army Corps engineers the Mississippi across the 1930s, and in the 1940s, they look at a major tributary of the Mississippi, the Missouri River. And in 1944, we have the Pick-Sloan Plan, and that's basically another interesting aspect of these multiple government institutions. Now, with the Army Corps of Engineers, and I'm hoping I don't have anybody in the room with relatives with the Corps, because they do great work, but there's an old joke in the Corps of Engineers, and that is that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and on the seventh that he rested, and the Army Corps of Engineers took over. That they went to work basically engineering nature. Like this is something that can be easily, readily, and safely done with no consequences. Subsequent events since the 1990s have proven otherwise, but it does get us into this notion of engineering nature being something that seems to be just the American thing to do. So the Army Corps of Engineers, they engineer things, including rivers, reservoirs, coastal systems, et cetera, et cetera. And the Bureau of Reclamation, believe it or not, it was designed to reclaim deserts as if they weren't naturally occurring. The deserts used to be something that was much, much more bountiful, and darn it, we're going to make them bloom again. And this is something that a lot of nations have in fact pursued, and then subsequently learned that there are in fact consequences to re-engineering nature. So we come back to New Orleans in the 1960s. The Missouri River Basin way upstream has been engineered. The Mississippi River Basin's been engineered. But still, in 1965, Hurricane Betsy hit. And it had a major impact on the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans generally. But this is where it's one of those moments where there's a lot of things that come together. Basically, what Hurricane Betsy did was move some of the last white families out of the lower Ninth Ward. And this, well, why? Okay, it's the hurricane. Well, it's the hurricane, but it's also the ongoing battles over the two Brown versus Topeka Board of Education cases. At the same time that all this engineering of rivers is going on, particularly in the 50s and 60s, America is going through its challenges to get rid of race-based segregation. particularly in its school system. And Hurricane Betsy provides the energy and impetus and opportunity for those last white families to really move out of the lower Ninth Ward. Not quite 30 years later, we got what I like to call the warning. The warning that hit the Missouri River Basin and the upper Mississippi River Basin. And some of you may recall this, but if you don't, here's the layout. We had a very, very wet spring and early summer in the upper Midwest, and reservoirs that the Army Corps of Engineers had built filled up, and the ground got waterlogged, and there was no place else for the water to go, so the Mississippi River swelled. And that helped swell the Mississippi River, and it hit lots of urban areas along the way. And the rain continued to come. And then the Army Corps of Engineers said, you know what? There's no more water to be let into the reservoirs, and the integrity of the reservoirs is now at stake. So we're going to actually have to, even though we know things were at flood stage, we're going to have to open the gates of the reservoir and drain some of this excess out, adding a man-made confluence to natural-made floodwaters. 20 million acres were flooded. It was headlines. CNN covered it, et cetera, et cetera. I just come back to the United States and go, great, my entire country seems to be underwater. But that was 1993, and that passed, and the number of communities, particularly given where they were in the upper Midwest, the sort of memory faded. But one of the things that went along with that, in the background, and why were the residents of the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans and elsewhere vulnerable? And that's because, ironically, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, charged with developing flood maps. Where are the areas most likely to flood? And this map kind of gives you an indication. There are areas that are completely unmapped. I'm really kind of worried about Alaska because they've not done anything there. But if you look at maps that are out of date or incomplete, you can see along coastlines and in parts of the Mississippi River Basin, including New Orleans, that those maps need a lot of work. But even if the work was done, one of the things that constituted the warning of 1993, we have good evidence that climate change, with today's weather being a good example, by the way, climate change was already underway by the 1990s. And that's what helped stoke the storm that became Katrina. And that's what helped unleash any number of other disasters subsequent to that along the coastlines of the United States. Last fall, you might recall that 1/3 of the nation of Pakistan was underwater. Pakistan being hit by a series of super monsoons. That's now a term now. I had no idea. The reality of it is that in some cases, we have the capacity to map, but the maps don't necessarily adequately accommodate and can't accommodate the changed environmental circumstances. But one last little bit. The government's also involved in terms of the housing and urban development business, because in some of these places, New Orleans being one of them, coastal areas in New York and New Jersey and Florida being other places, the government comes into these properties that have been flooded out. And they look to offload them, so they engage banks. And these banks very quickly find buyers, in many cases minority buyers, because these homes are more affordable. In some cases, they get subsidized loans. And unlike private commercial real estate brokers, there's not a lot of encouragement to buy flood insurance. In fact, overall in the United States, less than 4% of the people living in floodplains have flood insurance. So when we look at this thing, we see circumstances that are understandable, but it takes a little bit of digging, a little bit of swimming through research streams to kind of get this picture. Because when we talk about housing and urban development, as an organization and agency, and FEMA as an agency, and the Army Corps, and Bureau of Reclamation. If we look at what happened at Hurricane Sandy, at Far Rockaway, New York, area in Queens, Hurricane Sandy hit One of the places that got hit hardest was the Edgeware neighborhood in Far Rockaway, a community that was 80% plus African Americans. And one of the things that happened in the immediate aftermath of Sandy is that white families elsewhere in Far Rockaway were given a choice. You could take a government buyout, or betting that they were pretty well resourced, here's some additional monies that you can rebuild. But in Far Rockaway, many African-American families weren't given that option. And in some cases, because they did indeed lack the additional funds necessary to rebuild, they opted for the buyout and left. But the other thing that happened is Edgemere just happened to be located in an area where it had been discovered that if we basically turn this place back into a marsh area, a breakwater, this will help ensure other neighborhoods' safety in future hurricane and flood events. So there's a complex series of networks that operate within a fabric of a democracy that I'm not indicting anybody, but I am suggesting that the awareness of the interface and interplace of these agencies and the scope and scale of what we're facing as global climate change becomes any number of local challenging realities, that there is an opportunity, and indeed I would suggest an imperative for all of us to become a bit more aware of what's going on in the ground in a lot of areas where a lot of our fellow Americans who look differently suffer circumstances and consequences that we unfortunately only appreciate after the disaster has happened. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Rock. Thank you, all three of you. And with your permission, a few last words. Okay, Hannah? Okay. The last earthquakes in Turkey and Syria and in the Middle East symbolically represent not only a physical geological shock and the humanitarian tragedy, but also reminds us the political and social earthquakes caused by acts of human hatred and fanaticism. The earth is shaking beneath our feet, but our hearts and minds continue to beat with stability and determination. This symposium was definitely a proof of it. We shared a very special day with open-minded discussions and challenging ideas. We really became inspired. On behalf of all of us, I would like to thank again and again and again to Dean Chulos, Dean Mullen, and Dean Yoki, to Diane and Jill and Teresa, to our partners and co-editors, Professor Bo, Professor Aloni, to all authors that shared our book, and all who enabled this unforgettable symposium. And another few warm words to my dearest, closest friend, Professor Hannah Bo and Dr. Eyal Bo. You know, it's not, it's very known, I'm sure, that without you, nothing would have happened today. And I thank you very much personally. It's very, very important for us being here. I'm honored to be here. And as you know, even in that hour, after all this day, I'm still very excited, as you can hear. And last but not least, There is one person who is sitting there. He's Dr. Avi Ketko, my husband. I thank you for supporting me, for letting me have all my fantasies, and just being with me. You ought to be awarded. Thank you very much for all of you. It was a great day, a very important day, and I'm sure that we are not just talking, we are doing. Thank you very much.
Oh, we are almost at the dessert table over there with like some fruits and cake and all this amazing like thing that will keep you from falling asleep at home and keep you thinking about everything we talked about today. So before we close the evening, I have two special people to introduce to you. And then the first is Susanna Yoki, the Dean of the Library. Those of you who were here throughout the day, we saw this amazing exhibit that we have, which is part of the whole exhibit. I mentioned some other beautiful things at the Cook Library. And please, if you don't mind to come give us some few words. And after that, Jill Matt, she is the director of the Baltimore Hebrew Institute, and she helped us do this thing and sponsor the thing. So she sponsored the symposium, and she'll come and had the last word here today. Whatever words you need will be appreciated. So I'm not going to talk again today. You've heard me enough throughout the whole day. So I just want to say thank you, all of you, really. Thank you, those who came from Israel and those who came from Texas and our own Towson faculty and friends and faculty that were here the whole day. So really, thank you. I think we have amazing talent at Towson University, and I hope that this is just the beginning, and we will start displaying and exposing and dialoguing with among faculty between the two schools, College of Education, College of Liberal Arts, and learn from each other and appreciate each other and acknowledge each other's contribution to academic life and to thinking and to growing, and definitely to promote our 3Ds: dignity, democracy, and diversity. So I see this day as a beginning, hopefully, and not an end. So a beginning of collaboration. I already told Khaled we're going to start our second book soon with everybody else. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for the students, most important, for being here. So Dr. Yoki, please.
It's nice to see everyone. I want to mention that cake, I saw the Breezer's Bakery earlier, and I was like, the rainbow cake. And the rainbow cake is here now. I looked all over Baltimore for a rainbow cake for my daughter, and I got that one. It's really good. So you should have a piece. So today's program has been such an important contribution to the discussion on crucial issues for our future. As a public institution serving many underrepresented students, we cannot forget our role in ensuring their inclusion and ultimate success. We in higher education have an enormous responsibility and opportunity for making an impact on each student's social mobility and role in democracy, regardless of their skin color, immigration status, religious affinities, gender, or abilities. The threads of diversity, democracy, and humanity were woven throughout today's keynotes, panels, and programs. We discussed the complexities of life for refugees and forced immigrants and the roles higher education can serve in supporting displaced persons. We attended displays and exhibits featuring lost voices and voices that should be showcased. We acknowledged the power of teaching, highlighting personal narrative as a means to choose human dignity. Our panels discussed the important concepts of standing against bigotry, fighting racism and hatred, while also educating for humanity and talking about diversity and democracy. We leave today with further knowledge on how we model and teach activism for principles, especially many challenges educating our future generations, the many challenges we face with global crises. We're fortunate to work in an institution with a strong commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. Before I worked in academic libraries, I worked for for-profit corporations selling someone else's vision. I was drawn to academia because of the difference I could make in helping someone develop their own vision and be ultimately successful, especially if they hadn't had the opportunities that so many of us have been handed. Public education is so important. Higher education, especially institutions such as Towson University, serve the public good in developing critical thinking graduates who understand the value of protecting democracy, because those they learned from embedded principles of dignity, diversity, anti-racism, identity, and democracy in their teaching, scholarship, and service. I was delighted to be able to participate in this symposium and delighted that we had representation from Cook Library here as well. I arrived at Towson University 2.5 years ago and have very much enjoyed the partnership with the Baltimore Hebrew Institute. We've worked on many impactful programs together, including white glove sessions featuring primary source materials from our library's special collections and university archives. We co-hosted Evidence Against Intolerance, a virtual symposium on teaching the Holocaust in the digital disinformation era with funds from a Towson University Foundation grant. This symposium occurred nearly a year ago and featured many scholars, educators, and archivists who discussed the state of Holocaust education. More recently, we received funding from 2 foundations to begin a project to fully uncover our Jewish Cultural Reconstruction books, or our JCR books, which were books seized by the Nazis and then stored at the Offenbach archive after the war in the hopes of finding their rightful owners and heirs. Many institutions across Europe and the US received these books in the late 1940s, but did not properly catalog them or include book plates in them as they were instructed to do. So many of them are lost within those universities' collections. We have begun a project to relocate these books, looking for markings, stamps, and book plates in our own collection, and will document our best practice to share with other interested JCR book holders throughout the US, including Brandeis University and others. I appreciate our continual partnerships with Baltimore Hebrew Institute and know that there are many more collaborations to come. I thank Hannah Bohr for her work to host this symposium today and bring together so many insightful and thought-provoking presentations and panels. And for students that are here and you haven't looked at the Forget Me Not panels, you should. They're really interesting stories, and they're written to educate students on the Holocaust, and it's very powerful. It has been a pleasure to greet so many scholars and visitors from across the world today here at Towson University, and it's been an honor for Albert S. Cook Library to be included and featured in this important symposium. I thank you for all that you do for our libraries, our universities, and our students to help combat bigotry, celebrate diversity, and protect democracy. Thank you very much.
I have the easiest job. I just get to say thank you to everyone. And really, Hannah talked to me about this project when it was just an idea that she had. It was definitely 10 years ago. And to see it all come to fruition and the work that went on through the pandemic, and to really bring together what Susanna just talked about, collaboration, which is what Baltimore Hebrew Institute loves to do. We collaborate with the College of Education, with the library, across campus, with partners, whoever wants to partner with us. College of Fine Arts and Education, we just had an amazing exhibit, a ceramic exhibit last semester that many of the students who are here from COFAC probably got to see and enjoy. And just communicating and collaborating, that it's C's, not D's, but letter before in the alphabet. Anyway, there's a lot of food still to eat, students. That's why you get to stay and have the goodies at the end. So that's your reward for being here. But really, thank you to everyone. And really, Hannah and your colleagues, Dean Chulos, Dean Yockey, and Dean Mullen, thank you so much for your support. Enjoy the reception and have a good evening.